Thank you, Kevin Zeese. It's my pleasure to introduce Nicholas Johnson. I knew him when he was the boy wonder of Washington, D.C. He was appointed head of the Federal Maritime Administration at age 29 by President Lyndon Johnson. And not long after that, he was appointed to the Federal Communications Commission, where he became the all-time dissenter, the writer of commentary. I remember one of his books was called Talking Back to Your TV Set, where he basically reversed the dynamic and said, what about the First Amendment rights of the audience, not just of the broadcasters? Later confirmed in a famous court case called the Red Lions case, Federal Court of Appeals. He came out of Texas, born in Iowa, came out of Texas, University of Texas Law School. He held 3 presidential appointments, and the Yale Biographical Dictionary of American Law describes Nick Johnson as one of the 700 leading figures in the history of American law from the colonial period to the present day. He's been an author, a TV host, High Tech Times on PBS, you may remember, he hosted, public lecturer, radio commentator, syndicated columnist, congressional candidate, and co-director of a Public Health Institute. He's also school board member in Iowa. He teaches a course at the University of Iowa Law School on the media. I'll give you Nicholas Johnson.
Yes, my name is Nicholas Johnson, and I'm not running for anything. I thought you'd appreciate that. What you see here is my old FCC uniform. I would have come with the long hair and the shaggy beard and the cowboy mustache, but there wasn't enough time to grow all that hair. And so I just got me this Bernie Sanders haircut instead and decided I'd go with that. And having known and worked with Ralph and all of his family members for the past half-century, it's a great pleasure to be able to share this commemorating conference with them and you and those watching this on the real news. He's asked that I say something about the origins and values of the American broadcast regulation system, its demise, and the past efforts of media reformers, to which I'm going to add some thoughts on the options open to us in the 21st century. Because I am used to speaking for entire semesters at a time, my challenge this morning is putting all of this into my allotted 20 minutes. So here goes. Long ago, in a galaxy far away, while European countries were choosing government ownership of things like railroads and telephone systems, Americans chose private ownership, modestly restrained by government regulation. And so it was to be with broadcasting. Most countries went the way of the BBC, ultimately a nonprofit public corporation. Its first leader, Lord Reith, set the BBC's public service standard, quote, programming all that is best in every department of human knowledge, endeavor, and achievement. He created the equivalent of our fairness doctrine, and a BBC as independent of commerce as it was of government, be funded by fees from the listeners and ultimately viewers. Japan's NHK, Sweden's Sveriges Radio, and other countries followed this model. Today's Corporation for Public Broadcasting here is the American version. Now in the 1920s, as the sales of radio receivers accelerated to 100 million, so did the number of stations increase. and their signals interference made intelligible reception difficult to impossible. As has so often been the case, it was the broadcasters who came to government asking for regulatory relief. Government licensing was seen as a solution to chaos. Now, of course, there was a little added benefit, the elimination of competition. But what can you do? That's going to happen. Then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who you may have remembered from later in history, responded to their request by calling a series of radio conferences. And from them came the recommendations that ultimately became the Radio Act of 1927 and then the Communications Act 1934. It was the usual American compromise between the ideology of private ownership and the pragmatism of regulation through licensing. But the values at the foundation of the act, which were shared by broadcasters, government, and the public alike, were very similar to those of Lord Reith. His public service standard became the commission standard for the granting, renewal, or revocation of licenses. That radio programming must serve, quote, the public interest. Even broadcasters tended to agree with Secretary Hoover's comment, echoing Lord Reith's judgment, when Hoover said, quote, "It is inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility for service, for news, entertainment, and education to be drowned in advertising chatter." Lord Reith's preference for public over private ownership was reflected in the House floor debate about the Radio Act, as Congressman Luther Johnson warned his colleagues, quote, "American thought and politics will be at the mercy of those who operate these stations. If placed in the hands of a single selfish group, then woe be to those who would dare to differ with them." I thank you for Luther Johnson. Ultimately, the language of the act began, quote, "It is the purpose of this act to maintain the control of the United States over all the channels of radio transmission and to provide for the use of such channels, but not the ownership thereof. Without an FCC license, a studio and transmitter and antenna had little more than scrap value. But with that license, they were worth millions. Moreover, the FCC told the licensee where it could build, set its minimum and maximum hours, its transmitter's power, the direction of its signal. There were limits on how many licenses one could hold, maximums on advertising, and required minimums of educational and cultural programming, news, public affairs, and public service announcements. The Commission's 1946 Blue Book simply provided more detail. Thus, FCC licensees were owners in name only, with little more discretion than government employees or contractors might have had when using the public's airwaves, sort of like a fast food or motel franchisee. When I arrived at the Commission a half-century ago, the FCC was supposedly still regulating broadcasters according to standards at least similar to those of the 1920s and 30s. But in Washington, like most industries, broadcasting had its own sub-government. Dominant corporations, their lobbyists, a trade association, trade press, an eating club, agency employees, legislators and their staff, and a bar association for the communication lawyers, all of whose futures and fortunes turned on successfully protecting their circled wagons. Moreover, the money in this politics flowed upstream. Other industries had to pay to play. They gave the so-called campaign contributions to seek favor with elected officials. The reverse was true for the broadcasting industry. Elected officials gave most of their campaign contributions to the broadcasters. And the time and attention that the broadcasters were selling to politicians was something they could also give for free. So if the broadcasters were not successful in winning over the FCC commissioners and staff with private chats, free meals, receptions, golfing outings, and the prospects of future employment, they could always get what they wanted or prevent what they didn't want by going to their friends on Capitol Hill. As a result, I discovered, no matter how outrageous a broadcaster's performance might have been, the likelihood of a license not being renewed was so rare as to be indistinguishable from never. Rules were, thank you very much, it's a tough crowd, but I appreciate that. Rules were adopted and then waived. Congressman Luther Johnson's warnings about private power had been long since forgotten as merger after merger was approved. And that and more was what motivated me to write some 400 separate opinions during my term. Charged with unfairly picking only the worst cases, I co-authored a Yale Law Journal article titled, courtesy of the Beatles, A Day in the Life. And in it, we itemized an entire week's agenda, selected at random, and demonstrated how every decision that week left much to be desired. My term coincided with a citizen activist period in American history. Ralph Nader's Raiders consumer organizing, anti-war groups protests, civil rights legislation, Black Power demands, the women's movement, protest songs, and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. In such times, it was inevitable that failures of the media, as well as the Commission and the Congress, would ultimately lead to the creation of a media reform movement as well. As I put it at the time to all who would listen, whatever is your first priority, your second priority must be media reform. It took a variety of forms. Al Kramer's Citizens Communication Center provided the legal support for hundreds of media reform groups and communities across the country. Stations' license renewals were challenged for failure to serve their local communities or discriminatory employment practices. Some groups wanted to save classical music stations. Others created community or even illegal pirate radio stations. Video portapacks, the predecessor of today's ubiquitous smartphone videos, led to the interest in video art, guerrilla television, video activism, and what became cable television's public access channels. Foundations and donors were willing to provide at least minimal financial support for these efforts. And because the uprising had kind of caught the media establishment off guard, there were a few years of media reform Camelot. Following this, as at least some of you have lived through, the swamp waters returned. Many in the establishment made a sharp right turn to follow Grover Norquist. As he put it, "I'm not in favor of abolishing the government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where we can drown it in the bathtub." And drown it they did. At the FCC, this took the form of what was variously called re-regulation, or more accurately, deregulation. License terms were lengthened, restrictions on maximum station ownership, were reduced to the point of non-existence, the Commission would not even acknowledge that a license renewal challenge had been filed, let alone address it. And seldom, if ever, did a merger fail to meet the Commissioner's definition of the public interest. As the fickle foundations focused on a new squirrel and lost interest, media reform organizations lost their funding. The courts lost their appeal. The Congress and Commission lost their sense of hearing. Which brings us to this day in May of 2016. What are we to make of the Tea Party, the Occupy movement, and the millions of aware and angry Americans following Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders? Are we on the cusp of another burst of media reform, revolution, enthusiasm, and possibility? There's your voices. Okay. So using the name of our day at this 4-day conference, what can we do to break through the media? It would be nice if we could wrap up today with an easily remembered list of the 5 things you can do to improve the media. But it's not so simple. There are even more than 5 categories of things progressive activists can do before we start listing specific tasks, let alone trying to revigorate the FCC. Here are a few with illustrative examples. Destination. Let's start with the obvious. What's your goal? How would you know if you or your organization was ever successful? As the old line has it, if you don't know where you're going, the odds are very slim you'll ever get there. In what specific ways do you wish the media were different, and why? Are you trying to increase contributions or members for your local organization and think positive column inches in the paper will help? Or are you trying to improve our political campaigns and the public officials they produce? And your goal is to raise the entire American electorate's interest in articles and programming about the daily diet of policy wonks. Opportunity. The lack of a legal right does not remove all opportunity. The Supreme Court has given media owners legal control of content, but as we've recently observed, one can even win the presidential nomination of a major American political party without paying for broadcast time or newspaper space. Progressive causes do not always do all they could to promote their efforts with public radio and television. Even commercial media offer us opportunities with op-ed columns and letters to the editor in newspapers, guest appearances on television, calls to radio talk shows, developing relationships with editors, producers, journalists, and on-air personalities, making use of free kiosks, store windows, and bulletin boards. Education. There's something to be said for the suggestion, if you really want to improve the quality of American media, start by spending more public money on K-12 and higher education. Specifically, in our case, media literacy. If the media consumer can't tell the difference between the junk news in ABC's evening program and the truly significant, there's little more we can do. Then there's the question of what do we mean by media? We now have the social media to consider, and they've required the redefinition of journalist. Should it include everybody with a web page, blog, email list, Facebook, or Twitter account? Even more significant is that this increased diversity and quantity of communication brought with it a demise of the wealthy newspapers that formerly provided the electronic media with content. TV no longer offers a 21st century version of your grandparents' Walter Cronkite, the most trusted American. It no longer provides a huge swath of the citizenry, a shared body of consensus-building quality journalism each evening. And the resulting political polarization has paralyzed the Congress and prevented compromise. According to a recent TED Talk, it's even reprogrammed our brains. Alternatives. Are foundations and nonprofits a part of the answer? The Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism is filling some of the void in my home state. Created and run by Lyle Muller, a quality former editor of a major Iowa paper, Iowa Watch is making investigative pieces available to Iowa papers. What could we do to encourage our fellow citizens to volunteer to cover a beat that no longer has a journalist? Regulation. It's unlikely we'll soon return to the micromanaging of the 1920s through 50s, nor would it make as much difference if we did, because there's so much of audio-video content coming to Americans now from the internet, web pages, podcasts, YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, and independent cable programming producers. But that doesn't mean that the old media are devoid of influence. The FCC and Congress are still potential forces worth encouraging to support our efforts, as we've attempted, for example, with maintaining network neutrality. What we do to use and strengthen the Freedom of Information Act or whistleblower protection are also a form of government support of journalism. I might even offer what Donald Trump would call suggestions that we consider reinstating a modified fairness doctrine, at least as a shared value, and conceptualize an antitrust principle regarding media mergers that goes beyond the economic marketplace to the marketplace of ideas. Even private regulation, in quotes, can have some impact, as with the successful effort to reduce television violence in the 1970s by the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting, Project Censored, of which you'll hear more later, the Minnesota News Council that operated for 41 years. I think the Academy can contribute much more than it has in terms of professors' scholarships, seminars, and doctoral dissertations. And of course, we'll all want to join in with Ralph's latest venture in breaking through media's power, called simply Voices. Well, there's much more to say, but no more time to say it. And so I thank you for your attention and very much look forward to the rest of the presentations at this historic conference. And now I bring you, star of stage and screen, former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps.